A thick silvery fog had rolled off the loch overnight, swallowing the village of Lochdub in a dense, biting cold. It was the sort of heavy, isolating weather that kept the tourists away and the locals indoors, which suited Constable Hamish Macbeth perfectly. Hamish was currently huddled behind a rusted iron capstan on the pier, his lanky, red-haired frame folded up to avoid the icy chill. Beside him, his dog, Lugs, let out a soft whine. Hamish shushed him gently, offering the mongrel half of a slightly stale shortbread biscuit. They were both pretending they couldn't hear the shrill, persistent ringing of the telephone echoing from the open window of the police station, 100 yards away. "Let it ring, Lugs," Hamish murmured, pulling up the collar of his uniform jacket. "If it's DCI Blair, hell only be wanting me to do something dreadful like paperwork. Or work." Eventually, the ringing stopped, leaving only the sound of the water lapping against the stone. Hamish waited a cautious 10 minutes before unfolding himself and ambling toward the warmth of the Lochdub Hotel. He had a powerful, gnawing hunger that only a strong pot of coffee and a plate of something fried could cure. However, the moment Hamish opened the pub's heavy oak doors, he knew his peaceful, lazy morning was ruined. The air in the room was usually a comforting mix of stale beer, wood smoke, and quiet Highland gossip. Today, it was thick with tension. The locals were scattered at the edges of the room, nursing their pints with dark, simmering expressions. At the centre of the bar, holding court in a pristine, unnecessarily expensive tweed suit that screamed London, was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a Sassenach of the worst varietalloud, aggressively confident, and burdened with a surplus of money he was desperate to spend on improving things that didn't need it. He had arrived in the village 2 days prior, not in a vehicle, but having hiked in from the ferry with a pack of hired porters carrying his bespoke luggage, loudly complaining about the lack of a proper helipad. He had recently purchased the sprawling, neglected McLean estate just outside the village, with grand plans to transform it into an exclusive wilderness wellness retreat for exhausted executives. I am just saying, man to man, Thorne was booming at the publican, who looked as though he were chewing on a wasp. The lack of enterprise here is staggering. I asked for a simple flat white, and you presented me with something that tastes like it was brewed in a well boot. You people are sitting on a goldmine of rustic charm, but you haven't the faintest idea how to monetize it. Hamish quietly slipped into a corner booth, slouching low so he appeared to be half asleep. Through half-closed eyes, he watched the room. He might have looked like a slow-witted, useless village bobby, but Hamish noted everything. He saw the way the local baker's knuckles turned white around his pint glass. He noticed the postmistress glaring at the back of Thorne's perfectly coiffed head with venomous intensity. "Morning, Hamish," a voice muttered, as a chipped mug of black coffee slid onto his table. It was the barmaid, looking exhausted. He's been at it since 9. Insulted the minister's sermons, told old Mrs. Gallagher her jam was too sweet, and threatened to buy this pub just to fire everyone in it. "Has he now?" Hamish took a slow sip of the coffee, savouring the bitter heat. He didn't like Marcus Thorne. The man was a walking disruption to the quiet life Hamish had worked so hard to cultivate. Thorne suddenly slammed his hand on the bar, causing several glasses to rattle. "Service here is a joke," he announced to the room at large. "But that will change. Come next spring, when my retreat is open, this whole village will be working for me. Yow'll learn some bloody hustle then." Hamish sighed inwardly, giving Lugs a pat on the head. A man like that, throwing his weight and his money around a proud, isolated village like Lochdub, was a fool. Thorne thought he was dealing with simple, picturesque peasants. Hamish knew better. Highlanders had long memories, deep pride, and a very low tolerance for being treated like staff. Hamish took another sip of his coffee, a cold feeling settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the freezing fog outside. Someone in this room was going to teach Marcus Thorne a lesson, and Hamish's beautifully lazy week was going to pay the price for it. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's boastful proclamation was not the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a Highland storm gathering just behind the mountains. Hamish Macbeth sat very still in his corner booth, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his mug, though his ears were tuned to every shift in the room. He watched through his lashes as Thorne, apparently satisfied with the offence he had caused, signalled for another drinot, a dram of the local malt, but a complicated gin concoction he had spent 10 minutes explaining to the bewildered barman. Thorne took a long, arrogant swig of his drink, leaning back against the mahogany bar with the air of a conqueror. He checked his gold watch, tutted at the local time, and then suddenly stiffened. His face, previously flushed with the ruddy glow of expensive scotch and self-importance, turned a peculiar, chalky shade of grey. He clutched at his throat, his designer tweed jacket bunching up at the shoulders. A strangled, wet sound escaped his lip, something between a cough and a gurgle. The villagers watched with a detached, clinical sort of interest. To them, it looked like the Sassenach had simply swallowed his pride the wrong way. But Hamish stood up, his lazy slouch vanishing in a heartbeat. Thorne crashed forward, his forehead hitting the bar with a dull thud before he slid sideways, collapsing onto the sawdust-covered floor. His legs kicked twice, spasmodically, and then he went limp. The gin glass shattered against the brass footrail, the clear liquid mingling with the dark, viscous fluid leaking from the dead man's mouth. "Lord preserve us," whispered Mrs. Gillespie, the postmistress, clutching her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. Hamish was across the room in 3 long strides, Lugs trotting anxiously at his heels. He knelt beside the body, placing 2 long, calloused fingers against Thorne's neck. There was nothing. No pulse, no breath. Only the lingering scent of expensive botanical gin and something faint, bitter, and metallic that shouldn't have been there. Is he just drunk, Hamish?" the publican asked, his voice trembling as he leaned over the bar to look. "He's as dead as the Highland clearances, Barney," Hamish said softly, his voice tinged with a weary resignation. He looked down at the corpse. Marcus Thorne's eyes were wide open, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling with an expression of profound surprise, as if he couldn't believe death had the audacity to claim someone with such a high net worth. Hamish felt a familiar sinking sensation in his chest. This was going to be a disaster. A wealthy, loud-mouthed Englishman dropping dead in the village pub was exactly the kind of thing that brought the big men from Strathbane down on Lochstub like a ton of bricks. His hopes for a quiet afternoon of poaching a salmon from the lower pools of the Andub were evaporating like the morning mist. "Right then," Hamish said, standing up and dusting off his knees. "Nobody touched anything. Barney, lock the front door. Mrs. Gillespie, I'm afraid Yow'll have to put that gossip on hold for 5 minutes while I make a call." He walked toward the back of the pub, where the wall-mounted payphone sat. Lug sat by the body, guarding it with a low, mournful whimper. Hamish picked up the receiver and dialed the number for the Strathbane headquarters, his heart heavy. He knew exactly who would be assigned this. "Strathbane Police," a sharp voice answered. "Aye, it's Constable Macbeth from Lochstub," Hamish said, his tone deliberately slowing, adopting the thick, simple lilt he used to frustrate his superiors. "I'm afraid we've had a bit of a situation. Mr. Marcus Thorne, the gentleman who bought the old estate, he's gone and died right in the middle of the hotel bar. Most inconsiderate of him." "Died? What do you mean died, Macbeth?" "Heart attack." Hamish looked back at the body. He noticed a small, dark puncture mark on the man's hand, and the way his fingernails had turned a bruised purple. He also saw a tiny, discarded toothpick on the floor that Thorne had been using earlier to spear an olive. It looked innocuous, but Hamish's intuition's sharp, predatory instinct he hid behind his sleepy Isidawars screaming at him. "It might be the heart," Hamish lied smoothly, "but he's looking a bit blue in the face, and there's a terrible mess on the floor. You might want to send the DCI. He does love a good outing to the coast." He hung up before the sergeant on the other end could start shouting. Hamish knew DCI Blair would be livid. Blair hated the winding, single-track roads of the Highlands. He hated the smell of sheep, and most of all, he hated Hamish Macbeth. Hamish returned to the body, ignoring the frightened whispers of the locals. He began to pace the room in a slow, aimless-looking circle, appearing to the casual observer like a man who didn't know what to do with himself. In reality, he was cataloguing every person in the room. He saw the way the local doctor was sweating despite the chill. He saw the local poacher, Willie Lamont, quietly sliding a small, suspicious-looking bottle into his pocket, and he saw the beautiful, cold silhouette of Priscilla Halberton Smythe watching from the doorway of the residence lounge. He reached down and picked up a small piece of paper that had fallen from Thorne's pocket. It was a receipt from a local shop, but on the back, someone had scrawled a single word in angry, jagged handwriting. "Leave." "Poor soul," Hamish muttered to Lugs, though he didn't feel particularly sorry for the man. Thorne had been a bully and a bore. But in Lochstub, even bullies deserved a fair investigation, if only so Hamish could get back to his tea. The sound of a distant, screaming siren began to wail, echoing through the mountain passes. It was Blair. He was coming, and he would undoubtedly bring a whirlwind of incompetence and rage with him. Hamish sighed, leaning against the bar, and closed his eyes for just a second. "Well, Lugs," he whispered, "the peace is well and truly shattered. We might as well see if Barney has any of those mutton pies left before the vultures arrive." The pub door rattled as someone tried the handle from the outside. The murder of Marcus Thorne was no longer a village secret. It was now a police matter, and Hamish Macbeth's long, lazy day was officially over. The heavy silver fog that had choked Lochstub all morning suddenly broke, swept away by a biting wind rolling off the mountains. In its place came a sky of piercing, absolute blue, so clear and freezing that the frost on the heather sparkled like crushed glass. It was a beautiful, crisp Highland afternoon, utterly devoid of rain, which made the violent screech of tires on the frozen tarmac all the more jarring. There was no sleek, high-end vehicle heralding the arrival of Strathbane's finest. Instead, a violently mud-splattered police transit van and a battered, rust-spotted sedan came skidding to a halt outside the Lochdub Hotel, scattering a flock of indignant seagulls. The sedan's doors flew open before the engine had even fully choked to a stop. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking exactly like a man who had been marinating in cheap whiskey, stale cigarette smoke, and perpetual rage. Blair was a thick-set, red-faced man whose blood pressure seemed to be in a constant, terrifying race with his temper. He slammed the car door with enough force to rattle the windows of the hotel, pulling his ill-fitting beige trenchcoat tighter around his barrel chest. He hated the countryside. He hated the fresh air. He hated the fresh air. He hated the winding, treacherous single-track roads that had thoroughly scrambled his stomach, and above all else, he hated the tall, gangly, red-haired village bobby he was about to see. Storming toward the hotel doors, Blair was trailed by his two lackeys, Detectives Jimmy Anderson and Harry McNabb, both looking slightly green from the journey. Blair kicked the heavy oak door open with a scuffed brogue, storming into the pub like an invading army. The tense, quiet atmosphere of the room shattered instantly. The locals, who had been murmuring in low, anxious voices, immediately closed ranks. It was the classic Highland wall of silence, a collective freezing out of the loud, aggressive city men who thought they owned the place. Blair's small, piggy eyes swept the room, taking in the terrified publican, the defensive villagers, the corpse of Marcus Thorne lying awkwardly on the sawdust floor, and finally, settling on the lanky figure standing near the bar. Hamish Macbeth was leaning against the mahogany counter, looking as though he had just woken from a particularly deep nap, casually stroking the ears of his dog. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the smoke-stained ceiling. "Look at you!" A man lies dead on the floor of a public house, and you stand there petting that flea-bitten mop like a useless peasant. Have you secured the scene, or is that too much actual police work for your tiny, porridge-addled brain? "Good afternoon to you too, sir," Hamish said, his voice maddeningly slow, thick with a deliberate, exaggerated Highland lilt. "It's a grand, clear day for a drive, is it not? I put a coaster over his gin glass so the dust wouldn't settle in it, and lugs here don't have fleas. He's very particular about his hygiene." Blair's face shifted from its usual mottled red to an alarming shade of plum. He marched over to the body, pointedly ignoring Hamish's outstretched hand, and stared down at the unfortunate Marcus Thorne. "Look at this mess," Blair sneered, crouching down with a grunt of effort. "Who is he? And don't give me a rambling story about his grandfather's sheep, Macbeth. Just the facts, if you're capable of stringing them together. That would be Mr. Marcus Thorne, sir," Hamish replied mildly, clasping his hands behind his back and letting his shoulders slump. "A Sassenach gentleman. I moved here a few days ago. He was having a rather loud disagreement with the locals about the quality of our hospitality, took a sip of his fancy gin, and keeled over. Just like that. Baffling, truly." Blair snorted derisively, standing back up and brushing invisible dust from his coat. He didn't look closely at the body. He didn't notice the bruised, purplish tint of Thorne's fingernails, nor did he spot the tiny, discarded toothpick near the brass footrail that Hamish had carefully memorized earlier. Blair was a man who preferred blunt instruments to scalpels, and he immediately looked for the most obvious, convenient target to wrap the case up so he could get back to the city. His eyes locked onto Barney, the pale, trembling publican still standing behind the bar. "You!" Blair barked, jabbing a thick, nicotine-stained finger at the barman. "You poured the drink, didn't you? The local bobby says the man was complaining about your service. So you decided to shut him up, eh? Slipped a little something extra into the gin to teach the wealthy outsider a lesson." "No! I swear on my mother's grave, Inspector," Barney stammered, gripping the edge of the bar so tightly his knuckles were white. "I just poured the gin and tonic. I didn't put anything in it. The man was a nightmare, aye, but I wouldn't kill him over an insult to my flat whites." "Save it for the station!" Blair snapped, turning his back on the terrified man. "Anderson! McNabb! Read this publican his rights and get him in the back of the van. We're shutting this filthy pub down until the forensics boys from Inverness can scrape the floorboards." Hamish watched this display of spectacular incompetence with a carefully blank expression. He knew Barney hadn't killed Thorne. Barney couldn't even bring himself to trap the mice in the cellar, let alone orchestrate a calculated public poisoning. But Hamish also knew that trying to correct Blair now would only cause a shouting match, and worse, it might make Blair think Hamish was actually clever. The absolute last thing Hamish wanted was a commendation, a promotion, and a forced transfer to the dismal concrete labyrinth of Strathbane. "Excuse me, sir," Hamish said, shuffling his feet and looking at the floorboards like a chastised schoolboy. "If Yow'll be taking Barney away, who is to look after the pub? And what would you be wanting me to do?" "I haven't had my lunch yet, you see." Blair turned slowly, looking at Hamish with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. "You, Macbeth, are a disgrace to the uniform," Blair spat. "I want you out of my sight and out of my way. Go stand outside the front door and make sure none of these sheepshaggers try to leave the village. Do not touch the evidence. Do not speak to the press. In fact, try not to breathe too loudly. It might distract real police officers from doing their jobs." "Aye, sir." Outside the door. "I can manage that," Hamish mumbled, giving a clumsy, half-hearted salute. As Blair turned away to begin loudly terrorizing the rest of the patrons, Hamish slipped quietly out the front door, Lugs trotting happily beside him. The freezing air hit him again, but Hamish didn't mind. A small, secret smile touched the corners of his mouth. Being dismissed as a useless idiot was exactly what he had hoped for. Now that Blair was busy arresting the wrong man and making a great deal of noise, Hamish was completely free to wander the village, mooch a few cups of tea, and quietly find out who actually murdered Marcus Thorne. The freezing wind whistled through the narrow, salt-sprayed streets of Lochstub, but inside the village post office, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax, old paper, and the delicious buttery aroma of toasted scones. Hamish Macbeth stood by the counter, his tall, lanky frame hunched slightly to avoid hitting a hanging display of postcards. He looked every bit the defeated village bobby, his red hair tousled by the gale, and his expression one of mournful confusion. "It's a terrible business, Mrs. Gillespie," Hamish sighed, leaning his elbows on the laminate counter, while Lugs sat patiently by his boots, sniffing the air for crumbs. "DCI Blair is convinced poor Barney poisoned the man's gin. He's got the poor soul in the back of a van already, shouting about warrants and forensic sweeps. I feel like a right fool, standing there while the big men from the city take over." Mrs. Gillespie, a sharp-eyed woman who knew the contents of every envelope that passed through the village, huffed with indignation. She reached under the counter and produced a plate with 2 thick scones, slathered in jam. "That Blair is a loud-mouthed bully, Hamish. Anyone with half a brain knows Barney couldn't poison a rat, let alone a wealthy Sassenach in front of a dozen witnesses. Here, eat these. You look like you haven't had a decent meal since the frost set in." Hamish took a grateful bite, the warm jam a welcome relief against the chill in his bones. Grand scones, Mrs. Gillespie. Truly, it's just a shame Mr. Thorne had to go and die right when he was planning to bring so much enterprise to the glen. I suppose he had no friends here at all. The postmistress leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Friends? This man had enemies like a dog has fleas, Hamish. Did you know he's been receiving letters? Not the nice kind. 2 days ago, a typed envelope arrived for him no return address, posted from right here in the village. I shouldn't say, but I saw it through the paper when the light caught it. It told him to leave Lochstub, or head be carried out in a box." Hamish chewed slowly, his sleepy eyes sharpening for a fraction of a second before he went back to looking vacant. "Is that so? Well, someone was certainly a prophet. Did he have any visitors at that big drafty estate he bought? Or was he just shouting at the walls?" "He had a surveyor up there yesterday," Mrs. Gillespie said, enjoying the role of the primary informant. "A local man, though he tries to hide it with a fancy accent. And then there was that young fellow from the curry shop, looking quite distressed after Thorne threatened to have his lease revoked to build a yoga pavilion on the site. Oh, and I saw the minister walking up that way this morning with a very grim face indeed." Hamish nodded, making a mental note of the names. He finished the first scone and moved on to the second. "The minister, you say? Perhaps he was just worried about Mr. Thorne's soul. It was a very loud soul, after all." After thanking Mrs. Gillespie, Hamish wandered back out into the cold, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't head back to the hotel where Blair was undoubtedly still roaring at the furniture. Instead, he made his way toward the Lochstub Tandoori, a small, fragrant establishment run by Mr. Patel, who had moved to the Highlands 10 years ago and had long since mastered the art of survival in a climate that didn't suit his constitution. "Hamish! Come in, Mr. Patel called out, waving a flour-dusted hand. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. They say the Englishman is dead, and the police are arresting everyone who ever looked at him. "Not everyone, Mr. Patel. Just the ones DCI Blair can reach without bending over," Hamish replied, accepting a small cup of incredibly strong, sweet tea. I hear Mr. Thorne wasn't a fan of your lovely establishment. Mr. Patel's face darkened. He told me my shop was an eyesore. He said it clashed with the aesthetic vision of his wellness retreat. He offered me a pittance to move out, and when I refused, he said he'd find a way to make the health inspectors shut me down by Friday. He was a very cruel man, Hamish, but I did not kill him. My religion forbids such things, and besides, I don't have the stomach for it. I know you didn't, Mr. Patel, Hamish said gently, sipping the tea. But did you see anyone else talking to him this morning? Perhaps near the pub before it opened? Mr. Patel paused, rubbing his chin. I saw him arguing with a woman, a very elegant woman in a green coat. She looked quite furious. They were standing by the pier, and she pointed a finger right at his chest. I thought she was going to strike him, but she just turned and walked away toward the hotel. Hamish felt a prickle of interest. An elegant woman in a green coat sounded very much like Priscilla Halberton-Smythe, but Priscilla was far too composed to point fingers at strangers in public unless the stranger had done something truly unforgivable. As Hamish stepped back out into the street, he saw the police van rocking as it sped away towards Strathbane, carrying the unfortunate Barney to a cold cell. Blair's car followed, the DCI's red face visible through the glass as he barked into a radio. They were gone, leaving Hamish alone with the silence of the village and the growing list of people who had every reason to want Marcus Thorne silenced. He looked down at Luggs, who was wagging his tail expectantly. "Well, Luggs," Hamish murmured, "it seems Mr. Thorne was busy making himself unpopular with the post, the church, the local business owners, and the aristocracy all in one morning. It's a wonder he lived, as long as he did. Now, I think it's time we find Miss Priscilla and see what she has to say about aesthetic visions and pointed fingers." Hamish adjusted his cap, his gait still slow and seemingly aimless, but his mind was clicking through Lockdub's secrets like a well-oiled lock. He wasn't just mooching. He was gathering the threads of a very messy tapestry, and he intended to have the whole thing unravelled before Blair could even finish his first interrogation. The crisp, absolute blue of the afternoon sky was already beginning to soften into a bruised purple as Hamish Macbeth and his dog trudged up the long, winding gravel drive of the Halberton-Smythe estate. The temperature was plummeting, and a few stray, lazy flakes of snow had begun to drift down from the peaks of the mountains, dusting the frozen heather. Hamish shoved his hands deeper into the pockets of his regulation tunic, his stomach giving a pitiful rumble. Mrs. Gillespie's scones had been a mere appetizer to the gaping void of his hunger, and he knew from long experience that calling on Priscilla usually resulted in at least a decent cup of tea, if he looked pathetic enough. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe was in the glass-paned conservatory attached to the side of her family's sprawling stone mansion, aggressively pruning a potted fern. Even engaged in manual labour, she looked entirely flawless. Her golden hair was swept back, and she was wearing a thick, elegant wool coat of deep hunter green. Hamish paused outside the glass, watching her for a moment. She was beautiful, intelligent, and frustratingly out of his league, a fact that gave Hamish a familiar, dull ache in his chest. But she was also one of the few people in the area who possessed a mind as sharp as his own, even as she lacked his talent for hiding it. Hamish tapped lightly on the glass. Priscilla turned, her cool blue eyes softening a fraction when she saw the tall, shivering policeman and his equally shivering mongrel. She gestured for him to come around to the side door, her expression a mixture of exasperation and quiet fondness. Entering the conservatory was like entering another climate. It was wonderfully warm, smelling of damp earth, blooming flora, and expensive jasmine tea. A silver tray sat on a wrought iron table, holding a fragile porcelain teapot and a plate of tiny, perfectly triangular smoked salmon sandwiches. Hamish eyed the sandwiches with the absolute desperation of a starving man. Priscilla sighed, stripping off her gardening gloves and tossing them aside. She pointed a slender finger to a wicker chair, telling him to sit down before he collapsed and shed uniform lint all over the rare orchids. She nudged the plate across the table toward him. Hamish did not need to be told twice. He devoured 3 sandwiches in rapid succession while Luggs politely accepted a crust tossed onto the warm flagstones. Hamish washed the delicate food down with a cup of Earl Grey, letting out a long, happy sigh. He told her it was a terrible day for the village, with the loud English fellow choking on his own arrogance down at the pub. He adopted his most innocent, vacant stare, adding that DCI Blair had already carted poor Barney off in cuffs to Strathbane, convinced the publican had poisoned the gin over a bad review of the coffee. Priscilla let out a most unaristocratic snort of derision. She sat opposite him, pouring herself a cup of tea. She flatly said Blair was an absolute idiot. Barney wouldn't dare poison a customer, he was too worried about losing his liquor license to the local council. Furthermore, she added, Marcus Thorne was not the sort of man you killed over a bad cup of coffee. You killed Marcus Thorne because he backed you into a corner and left you with no other options. Hamish stopped chewing, allowing his lazy facade to slip just a fraction. He leaned forward, his hazel eyes locking onto hers, the sleepy dimness replaced by a sudden, sharp intelligence. He mentioned that Mr. Patel from the tandoori shop had seen her pointing a rather angry finger at Thorne by the pier that morning. He asked her, gently, what business a fine lady like herself had shouting at a property developer before breakfast. Priscilla did not blush or flinch. She simply looked out through the frost-rimmed glass toward the dark waters of the loch. She explained that Thorne was not merely a clumsy, loud-mouthed developer. She had recognized him the moment he stepped off the ferry, though he hadn't recognized her. Years ago, in London, Thorne had run in the same social circles as some of her father's acquaintances. He made his fortune not through honest development, but by finding people who were financially vulnerable, discovering their most embarrassing secrets, and squeezing them until they sold their properties for pennies to keep him quiet. She turned her gaze to Hamish. She told him that Thorne wasn't down at the pier to look at the view. He had been harassing Willie Lamont, the local poacher. She had overheard Thorne telling Willie that he knew exactly how much poached salmon and stolen venison Willie had been selling to the fancy restaurants in Inverness. If Willie didn't help him sabotage the deeds to the McLean estate's neighbouring farms, Thorne would see him sent to a bleak prison cell. Priscilla had intervened, threatening to call her father's lawyers and have Thorne buried in endless injunctions if he didn't leave the locals alone. Hamish absorbed this information in silence, taking another sandwich to mask his racing thoughts. This changed the landscape entirely. DCI Blair was looking for a spontaneous act of rage from an insulted bartender. But Hamish now knew he was looking for an act of desperate self-preservation. Thorne was a blackmailer. The scrap of paper Hamish had found in Thorne's pocket, the one with the word leave scrawled on it, wasn't just a threat from an annoyed neighbour. It was a plea from a trapped victim. Priscilla leaned closer, her voice dropping lower. She added one more crucial detail. She told Hamish that men like Thorne, men who ruined lives for a living, were deeply paranoid. He never ate or drank anything unless he saw it poured or prepared right in front of him. He wouldn't have just swallowed poison blindly. Someone in that pub must have managed to slip it to him in plain sight, using something Thorne entirely trusted, or something he was too distracted to notice. Hamish stood up, brushing a stray crumb from his uniform trousers. He looked at Priscilla, feeling a surge of genuine affection and immense respect. She had, as always, seen right to the ugly heart of the matter, while the rest of the village was distracted by the noise. He thanked her for the tea, his voice slipping back into its usual, slow Highland drawl. He told her she made a grand sandwich, and that she ought to stay indoors until the snow stopped falling. As Hamish and Lugs walked back down the drive into the biting wind, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift and lock into place. Willie Lamont had a motive. The postmistress had seen the warning letter. The doctor had been sweating at the scene. Thorne had been spearing olives with a tiny wooden toothpick, a toothpick that a paranoid, wealthy man would surely never carry himself. The murder hadn't been an impulsive act of anger. It had been a careful, calculated execution, and Hamish was starting to realize exactly how the trap had been sprung. The snow that had begun as a few lazy flakes up at the Halberton Smythe estate was now falling in thick, heavy curtains, turning the winding streets of Lochstub into a stark, silent landscape of white. The biting cold gnawed at Hamish Macbeth's ankles as he trudged back toward the police station, his shoulders hunched against the chill. Lugs trotted faithfully beside him, his wiry coat dusted with snow, occasionally stopping to sniff at a frozen patch of heather. Hamish's mind was turning over the puzzle of Marcus Thorne, the blackmailer who had choked to death on his own paranoia, when he saw the mud-splattered Strathbane police van parked haphazardly outside his station. DCI Blair had returned. Hamish let out a long, weary sigh, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the station, immediately assailed by the smell of damp wool, stale cigarette smoke, and the unmistakable vibrating tension of Blair's fury. The small, cramped office was practically vibrating with it. In the centre of the room, sitting on a hard wooden chair with his cap clutched in his hands, was Willie Lamont. The local poacher looked utterly terrified. His weather-beaten face was pale, and he was shrinking away from Blair, who was standing over him, red-faced and shouting so loudly that the single bulb hanging from the ceiling seemed to quiver. Detectives Anderson and McNabb flanked the door, looking bored and eager to get back to town. Hamish quietly closed the door behind him, taking off his snow-crusted cap and shaking it out. He moved slowly, deliberately playing the part of the vacant, simple-minded village bobby. He ambled over to the ancient cast-iron stove in the corner, picked up the rusted kettle, and gave it a shake to check the water level, entirely ignoring the interrogation happening 3 feet away. Blair whipped around, his small, piggy eyes narrowing at the interruption. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Hamish. He demanded to know where the village idiot had been while real police officers were out solving the crime. Hamish kept his gaze fixed on the stove, striking a match and holding it to the burner. He murmured that he had just been out making sure the snow wasn't blocking the roads for the DCI's journey home, and perhaps mooching a sandwich to keep his strength up. He added, in a tone of mild, sleepy curiosity, that he was surprised to see Willie Lamont in the chair, considering Barney the publican was supposed to be the master poisoner of the Highlands. Blair let out a derisive snort, his face shifting to a triumphant sneer. He slammed a small, grubby glass vial onto Hamish's desk. It was the exact same bottle Hamish had seen Willie slick into his pocket at the pub, right after Thorne collapsed. Blair announced that the publican was just a terrified bystander, but Willie here was the real killer. He declared that Willie had motive, having been threatened by Thorne earlier that morning, and he had the means, pointing to the vial which he claimed was highly concentrated fox poison. Willie let out a miserable groan, burying his face in his hands. He swore blind that he hadn't killed the Sassenach. He admitted he had been at the pub, and he admitted he hated the man, but he insisted he had never laid a finger on Thorne's gin glass. Hamish struck another match, watching the flame dance for a moment before dropping it into the stove. He knew Willie was telling the truth. He picked up the small glass vial from the desk, holding it up to the dim light. The liquid inside was thick, dark, and smelled powerfully of fermented yeast, old peat, and raw ethanol. It wasn't fox poison. Hamish recognized the smell instantly. It was a particularly potent, eye-watering batch of illegal home-brewed whiskey that old Mrs. Wellington made in her bathtub, an elixir so strong it was mostly used to strip paint or knock out a toothache. Hamish put the vial down, scratching his red hair under his cap. He looked at Willie, and then he looked at Willie's hands. The poacher's hands were massive. They were the size of dinner plates, thick with muscle, scarred from years of wrestling fishing wire and setting snares in the dark. More importantly, they were permanently stained with dark peat, engine grease, and the undeniable grime of a man who lived his life in the mud. Hamish turned to Blair, letting his shoulders slump into a posture of utter subservience. He adopted his thickest, most agonizingly slow Highland drawl. He asked the DCI, purely out of foolish curiosity, how the poison had been delivered. Blair puffed his chest, saying the Inverness forensics team had called it in 10 minutes ago. It wasn't in the gin itself. It was on the tiny wooden toothpick used to spear the olive in the drink. A lethal, fast-acting dose of aconite, derived from wolfsbane, had been soaked into the wood. The killer, Blair explained with arrogant certainty, had simply slipped the poisoned toothpick into the glass when Thorne wasn't looking. Hamish blinked, his face a perfect mask of bewildered stupidity. He looked back at Willie's enormous, filthy hands, and then he looked at Blair. He pointed out, very gently, that Mr. Thorne was a terribly fussy gentleman. He recalled how Thorne had thrown a spectacular tantrum earlier because there was a microscopic water stain on his fork. He asked Blair, in the tone of a child asking about the moon, if he truly believed a paranoid, wealthy snob like Marcus Thorne would have calmly watched a man with hands entirely caked in sheep dung and engine oil reach over his expensive drink to drop a toothpick into it. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the hiss of the kettle on the stove and the howling of the wind outside. Jimmy Anderson coughed to hide a sudden laugh. MacNab looked at the ceiling. Blair stared at Willie's massive, dirt-encrusted hands, which were currently resting on his knees. The physical impossibility of it settled over the room like a heavy woolen blanket. Willie could not have threaded a needle, let alone delicately handled a poisoned toothpick and slipped it into a paranoid man's drink without causing an immediate, screaming commotion. Blair's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a furious, mottled purple. The veins in his neck pulsed. He snatched the vial of moonshine off the desk and shoved it into his pocket, refusing to look at Hamish. He barked at Anderson to get the poacher out of his sight before he arrested him for wasting police time. Willie practically scrambled out the door, throwing a look of desperate, absolute gratitude at Hamish as he fled into the snow. Blair grabbed his trench coat, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He promised Hamish that he would find the real killer, and when he did, he would personally see to it that the village bobby was written up for insubordination and transferred to traffic duty in the bleakest corner of Glasgow. As the Strathbane detective stormed out, leaving the door wide open to the freezing wind, Hamish calmly walked over and shut it. He poured himself a cup of boiling water from the kettle, dropping a single withered tea bag into the mug. The red herring had been cleared. The killer wasn't the poacher, and it wasn't the bartender. It was someone who belonged in that pub, someone who could handle a drink without raising suspicion, someone with clean hands and a reason to want Marcus Thorne silent forever. Hamish took a slow sip of his terrible tea, a grim smile finally touching his lips. He knew exactly where to look next. The snow kept falling, draping the village of Lochdub in a deceptive, silent purity that masked the rot of a murder investigation. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth sat by the glowing embers of his peat fire, the orange light flickering across his lean, thoughtful face. Lugs were sprawled at his feet, dreaming of rabbits, but Hamish was wide awake. He was no longer the bumbling village bobby, he was a man dissecting a puzzle with the precision of a surgeon. The motive was the key. As Priscilla had pointed out, Marcus Thorne wasn't just an arrogant outsider, he was a professional parasite who fed on the secrets of others. To kill a man like that in a room full of people required more than just hatred, it required a desperate kind of courage and a very specific opportunity. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of paper he had, scavenged from the floor of the pubbed one, with a jagged leave written on the back. He smoothed it on his knee, staring at the handwriting. It wasn't the refined script of the aristocracy, nor was it the rough scrawl of a man like Willie Lamont. It was precise, practiced, and familiar. Hamish stood up, pulled on his heavy greatcoat, and whistled for lugs. They stepped out into the freezing night, the air so cold it felt like needles in his lungs. He didn't head for the hotel or the grand houses on the hill. Instead, he made his way toward the small stone cottage at the edge of the village where Dr. Brodie lived. Dr. Brodie had served Lochdub for 30 years. He was a man who knew the internal workings of every villager, both physical and metaphorical. When Thorne had collapsed, Brodie had been the first on the scene, yet he had remained strangely silent while Blair roared and pointed fingers. As Hamish approached the cottage, he saw a light burning in the surgery window. He knocked gently. A moment later, the door creaked open, and the doctor peered out. He looked exhausted, his white hair standing up in tufts, and his eyes red-rimmed behind thick spectacles. He didn't look like a murderer, but in Hamish's experience, the most dangerous people rarely did. "Hamish!" Brodie said, his voice a weary rasp. "It's a bit late for a social call, isn't it? If you're looking for more tea, I'm fresh out." "I am not looking for tea, Doctor," Hamish said softly, stepping into the warm hallway without waiting for an invitation. "I am looking for the truth about Marcus Thorne, and I think you're the only man in the Glen who can give it to me." They sat in the doctor's cramped study, surrounded by stacks of medical journals and the smell of antiseptic. Hamish didn't play dumb this time. He laid the leave note on the desk between them. He told the doctor that he had seen him sweating at the pub. He mentioned that he knew Thorne was a blackmailer, a man who dug up the past to bury people's futures. Dr. Brodie stared at the note for a long time. Finally, he let out a jagged sigh and leaned back, his shoulders sagging. He confessed that Thorne had come to him a week ago. The man had somehow obtained the old medical records from the doctor's early days in London records that detailed a tragic, clinical error Brodie had made as a young intern, an error that had cost a life and been quietly hushed up by the hospital board. Thorne had threatened to publish the details in a national newspaper, destroying Brodie's reputation and the peaceful life he had built in the Highlands, unless the doctor helped him persuade the local council to approve his wellness retreat. The man was a monster, Hamish, Brodie whispered, his hands trembling. He didn't want money. He wanted power. He wanted to own us. "And so you killed him?" Hamish asked, his voice devoid of judgment. Brodie looked up, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He denied it. He admitted he had thought about it, had even written that note in a fit of despair, but he claimed he didn't have the stomach for murder. He told Hamish he wasn't the only one Thorne was squeezing. The man had been a whirlwind of destruction. He had even been seen arguing with the young schoolmistress, Mary Ross, who had been looking increasingly frail and nervous since Thorne's arrival. Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the weather. Mary Ross was a sweet, quiet girl who had moved to Lochdub to escape a troubled past in the city. If Thorne had found out whatever she was hiding, she wouldn't have had the resources to fight him, but there was something else. Hamish remembered the toothpick. He remembered how Thorne had been using it to spear an olive from a small jar on the bar. Bardi the publican didn't serve olives in jars, he kept them in a plastic tub behind the counter. The jar had been on the bar before Thorne arrived. "Doctor," Hamish said, standing, "did you see who put that jar of olives on the bar this morning?" Brodie frowned, thinking back. He recalled it had not been Barney. He remembered a womanot Priscilla, and not Merry but someone who moved through the pub with the invisibility of a ghost, someone everyone trusted, and no one ever really looked at. The realization hit Hamish with the force of a physical blow. The motive wasn't just about a past grudge or a hidden affair, it was about something far more petty and human. It was about preserving the only home anyone had ever known. Marcus Thorne hadn't just threatened individuals, he had threatened the very fabric of the village. He had promised to fire the staff, change the landmarks, and turn Lochdub into a playground for the rich. Hamish thanked the doctor and retreated into the snow. He knew now that the murder wasn't the work of a desperate victim acting alone. It was a crime born of a collective, silent agreement. The villain wasn't someone who had hidden in the shadows. It was someone who had been standing in the light all along, counting on the fact that a stupid policeman like Hamish Macbeth would never look past the obvious. He walked toward the darkened silhouette of the Lochdub Hotel, his mind clear. The hidden motive was finally in view. It wasn't about money or glory, it was about the cold, hard necessity of removing a cancer before it could spread. And Hamish knew exactly who had held the scalpel. The snow had stopped, leaving Lochdub wrapped in a silence so profound it felt as though the village were holding its breath. The moon hung over the loch like a cold silver coin, casting long blue shadows across the frozen pier. Hamish Macbeth did not return to his station to sleep. Instead, he made his way to the back door of the Lochdub Hotel, lugs trotting silently by his side. Inside the hotel kitchen, the air was still warm, smelling of dish soap and the lingering grease of the day's service. Sitting at the heavy wooden prep table was Mrs. McLean, the hotel's longtime housekeeper and the woman who kept the entire establishment running while the men shouted and the tourists complained. She was a small, unassuming woman with hands that never seemed to stop moving, currently busy polishing a set of silver spoons. "A late hour for a visit, Hamish," she said, not looking up. "I'd offer you a cup of tea, but the DCI has made a proper mess of my pantry with his evidence bags and his muddy boots." "I don't need tea, Mrs. McLean," Hamish said, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a heavy sigh. He looked tired, his red hair damp from the melting snow. "I am in a terrible spot. DCI Blair is convinced it was Willie Lamont, but the forensics from Inverness are coming back with something very peculiar. They found a second jar of olives, you see." Mrs. McLean's hand swayed for a split second, the spoon clicking against the table. "Is that so? I didn't know the police were so interested in snacks." Hamish leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. He adopted a tone of worried, confidential intimacy. He told her the problem was not the olives themselves, but the fingerprints. He explained, with a deceptive air of stupidity, that the lab found a very specific set of prints on the jar that was on the bar prints that matched someone who shouldn't have been serving drinks at all. He added that Blair was already signing the arrest warrants, but Hamish was worried they were going to pick up the wrong person again. "It's a shame," Hamish murmured, watching her closely. "Because if that person were to, say, realize that the poison jar was still hidden somewhere in this kitchen, they might try to get rid of it before the specialist team arrives at dawn. And if I were to catch them doing it, I might be forced to make a very loud arrest. But if the jar just vanished completely before I saw it, well, I am just a lazy village bobby who misses things. Aren't I?" Mrs. McLean finally looked at him. Her eyes were hard and sharp, devoid of their usual grandmotherly softness. She didn't say a word. Hamish stood up, whistled for lugs, and walked out the back door, leaving it slightly ajar. He didn't go far. He slipped into the shadows of the coal shed, a few yards away, and waited. The cold seeped into his boots, but he remained as still as a hunting heron. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, the hotel's back door creaked open. A dark figure slipped out, clutching a small glass object wrapped in a white kitchen towel. The figure hurried toward the edge of the pier, where the deep, black waters of the loch waited to swallow secrets forever. As the figure raised their arm to hurl the bundle into the water, Hamish stepped out of the shadows. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his truncheon. He simply clicked his tongue. "I wouldn't do that, Mrs. McLean," he said softly. "The water is clear tonight. We'd see the splash, and I'd have to go for a very cold swim to retrieve it." The housekeeper froze, her arm trembling. She turned to face him, the moonlight catching the lines of fury and grief on her face. She didn't look afraid, she looked exhausted. She asked him how he knew. Hamish walked toward her, his voice gentle. He told her that it wasn't the fingerprint shed lied about those. It was the hospitality. He reminded her that Marcus Thorne had boasted about firing the entire staff once his retreat opened. He knew that Mrs. McLean had worked at the hotel for 40 years, that her cottage was tied to her employment, and that she had nowhere else to go. But more than that, Head noticed her hands. "You're the only person in the village who uses that particular floral hand cream, Mrs. McLean," Hamish said. "The scent was all over that toothpick, and I saw you polishing the bar right before Thorne arrived. You didn't just clean the wood, you swapped the jars. You knew Thorne was paranoid. That head only eat something if it looked like it was already there, safe and open. Mrs. McLean slumped against a wooden piling, the bundle still clutched in her hand. She confessed everything in a low, flat voice. She told him how Thorne had come to her in the linen room, mocking her age and telling her she'd be out on the street by Christmas. He had laughed when she cried. She had realized then that Thorne was a plague on the village, a man who would destroy everything they loved for a bit of sport. So, she had taken a bit of the wolfsbane from the doctor's Gardentha Doctor Who, was also being bullied, and she had done what needed to be done for the sake of Lockdub. "I am not sorry, Hamish," she whispered, looking him in the eye. "He was a bad man. The Glen is better off without him." Hamish looked at the small woman, then out at the dark, freezing loch. He knew she was right about Thorne, but he also knew that murder was a heavy burden for a village to carry. He reached out and took the bundle from her hand. "The problem is," Hamish said, his voice taking on its familiar, slow lilt, "that DCI Blair is a very vain man. He wants a big, flashy arrest. He wants a mastermind. He won't like the idea of a hard-working housekeeper outsmarting him. It would make him look like a fool. And as you know, I am very keen on making sure the DCI gets exactly what he wants." He looked at the jar of olives through the cloth. Then, he looked at the police station where the lights were still burning. He told Mrs. McLean to go back inside and finish her silver. He told her to forget they had ever spoken. "I have a plan, Mrs. McLean," Hamish said, a trace of his dry, sceptical humour returning. "It involves a bit of theatre and a great deal of shouting from the DCI, but it requires you to be very quiet and very surprised when the killer is caught." As she scurried back into the warmth of the hotel, Hamish looked down at the evidence in his hand. The trap was set, but it wasn't for the housekeeper. It was for the man currently sleeping in a warm bed in Strathbane, dreaming of promotions. Hamish began to walk toward the hotel's main entrance, his mind already crafting the story he would tell. It was time for the final act, and he intended to make sure Marcus Thorne's death served one last purpose, keeping Hamish Macbeth exactly where he wanted to be. The following morning broke with a sky so clear it was painful to look at, the sun reflecting off the fresh Highland snow with a blinding, diamond-like intensity. It was the kind of morning that should have been spent checking lobster creels or sleeping late, but Hamish Macbeth was already busy. He had spent the dawn hours making several phone calls and leaving a trail of very specific, very scandalous rumours in the ears of the village's most reliable gossip. By 10 o'clock, the village was a stage. Hamish stood in the middle of the road, looking more dishevelled than usual, his tie crooked and his expression one of frantic, bumbling panic. When DCI Blair's car screeched into the square, the DCI was already halfway out the door before the vehicle had stopped, his face a bright, dangerous shade of magenta. He had received a tip-off that Hamish had accidentally uncovered the murder weapon and was about to let the suspect slip away. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, his voice echoing off the stone cottages. "I hear you've been tampering with evidence again. If you've let that poacher go or hidden the poison, he'll have your badge and your skin for a rug." "Oh, sir, thank goodness you're here," Hamish cried, waving his arms with exaggerated relief. "It's terrible, just terrible. I found the jar, you see. The one with the poisoned olives. But I am afraid I've made a mess of it. I left it on the pier while I went to fetch a bag, and now someone's trying to steal it." Blair did not wait for further explanation. He shoved Hamish aside and charged toward the pier, his detectives Anderson and MacNab scrambling to keep up. There, standing at the very edge of the stone jetty, was a figure draped in a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, clutching a glass jar and looking poised to leap into the icy waters of the loch. "Freeze! Police!" Blair bellowed, reaching for his handcuffs. The figure turned, and to Blair's immense shock, it wasn't the poacher or the publican. It was a man Blair didn't recognize, a tall, wiry fellow with a frantic look in his eyes. In reality, it was Willie Lamont's cousin, a local actor from the Amateur Dramatic Society whom Hamish had recruited with the promise of a very large salmon and a clean criminal record. "You'll never take me alive!" the suspect shouted, overacting magnificently. He made a move to throw the jar, but Blair, driven by the prospect of a career-making arrest, lunged forward with surprising speed. The confrontation was short, messy, and loud. Blair tackled the man into a snowbank, the two disappearing into a cloud of white powder and flying limbs. Anderson and MacNab piled on, shouting orders that nobody followed. In the chaos, the glass jar fell from the man's hand, rolling across the stone and shattering near the water's edge. Hamish stood back, watching the scuffle with a look of mild, detached interest. He noticed Mrs. McLean watching from the hotel window, and he gave her a tiny, imperceptible nod. The suspect was eventually hauled up, covered in slush and looking thoroughly ruffled. Blair stood triumphantly over him, gasping for air and wiping snow from his mustache. "I've got him, Macbeth!" Blair wheezed, his chest heaving. A professional hitman, no doubt, sent by Thorne's business rivals. "I knew it wasn't some local peasant. This is big, Macbeth. This is international." "It certainly looks that way, sir," Hamish said, stepping forward to peer at the prisoner. "A very dangerous-looking fellow indeed. And look, the jar is broken, but there's enough liquid left for the lab. You've saved the day, Inspector, truly." The actor, playing his part to the end, spat on the ground and muttered something about city coppers, which only served to inflate Blair's ego further. Blair beamed, despite the fact that he was soaked to the bone and shivering. He barked orders at his team to secure the prisoner in the van and to gather every shard of the broken glass. But the real confrontation happened a moment later, away from the noise of the arrest. As the detectives were busy, a second figure approached Hamishoni he hadn't expected to see. It was the young schoolmistress, Mary Ross. She was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and realization. She looked at the broken glass, then Hamish, then the hotel. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You knew it was for us, for the village." Hamish looked at her, his sleepy eyes suddenly very dark and very ancient. He didn't confirm or deny anything. He merely adjusted his cap and looked out at the mountains. He told her that sometimes the Highlands had a way of protecting their own, and that it was a very lucky thing DCI Blair was such a brilliant detective, capable of catching an international assassin in a snowbank. "Go home, Mary," Hamish said gently. "The school will be needing you on Monday, and the hotel will be staying right where it is. The drama is over." As Blair's convoy prepared to leave, the DCI turned to Hamish one last time. He told Hamish that he was still a useless, bone-idle bobby, but admitted that even a blind pig finds an acorn once in a while. He warned Hamish not to expect any credit for the arrest, as Blair would be writing the report himself to ensure the complex nuances of the case were properly recorded for the chief constable. "I wouldn't dream of it, sir," Hamish said, giving a clumsy, respectful salute. "I am just happy to have such a fine officer like yourself keeping us safe. I'll just stay here and watch the sheep. It's all I am fit for, really." Blair snorted, slammed the car door, and sped away, leaving Lochdub in peace. Hamish watched the taillights disappear around the bend of the road. The threat of the outsider was gone, the real killer was safe in her kitchen, and most importantly, Hamish Macbeth was still exactly where he wanted to be. He whistled for lugs, his stomach giving a loud, demanding growl. The confrontation had been exhausting, and he was quite sure there was a pot of mutton stew with his name on it waiting at the station. 2 days later, the sky over Lochdub was a brilliant, bruised violet as the sun dipped behind the snow-capped mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows across the freezing waters of the loch. The biting winds had finally died down, leaving a stillness so profound that the only sound was the distant, rhythmic shushing of the tide against the stone pier. The village had completely absorbed the shock of Marcus Thorne's demise, folding the scandal into its collective memory like a dark secret tucked into the back of a cedar drawer. Hamish Macbeth slouched comfortably against the counter of the village post office, nursing a cup of tea that Mrs. Gillespie had pressed into his hands. Spread on the laminate surface before him was the morning edition of the Strathbane Courier. The headline took up a quarter of the front page, printed in bold, screaming letters. "Strathbane's finest foils syndicate plot. DCI Blair captures London assassin in Highland sting." Below the headline was a large, slightly blurry photograph of Detective Chief Inspector Blair looking immensely stern and important, his trench coat blowing heroically in the wind. The article detailed a harrowing narrative of international blackmail, shady real estate syndicates, and a brilliantly executed trap set by the intrepid Blair. It mentioned the capture of a dangerous operative, who, according to the paper, had managed to slip through the fingers of the law due to a lack of solid physical evidence at the station, but not before Blair had heroically shattered the murder weapon. There was no mention of poisoned olives, no mention of floral hand cream, and absolutely no mention of a vengeful housekeeper. Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, masking a deeply satisfied smile behind the rim of the chipped mug. He let out a long, theatrical sigh, shaking his head. He told Mrs. Gillespie that it was a marvel, truly, how the big city detectives could see so much that a simple local man missed entirely. He added that he was just grateful a genius like DCI Blair had been available, because a complicated plot like an international syndicate would have completely baffled his own poor brain. Mrs. Gillespie sniffed dismissively, polishing her spectacles on the hem of her cardigan. She stated flatly that the man in the paper looked like an overstuffed sausage and that anyone with eyes knew he was a bullying fool. But she kept her voice low, and her eyes darted toward the window, looking out at the peaceful street. The village knew the truth, or at least, they knew enough not to ask questions that might disturb the hard-won peace. They had all tacitly agreed to accept the London assassin's story. It was neater that way, and it protected one of their own. Leaving the post office, Hamish ambled back out into the freezing dusk, Lugs trotting happily at his heels. The air smelled of salt, frost, and the sharp tang of wood smoke drifting from the cottage chimneys. The natural order of Lochstub had been seamlessly restored. As he passed the Lochstub tandoori, he saw Mr. Patel standing outside, sweeping his front step with a wide, untroubled smile. The threat of eviction entirely vanished. Near the edge of the woods, Hamish caught a brief glimpse of Willie Lamont disappearing into the shadows with a burlap sack that looked suspiciously heavy, no doubt containing a poached salmon destined for an Inverness kitchen. Hamish looked the other way, his duty as a policeman temporarily suspended in favour of his duty as a Highlander. When Hamish finally reached the police station, he found the front door locked just as he had left it, but sitting squarely on the front step was a large, heavy wicker basket. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a pristine white tea towel bearing the faded crest of the Lochstub Hotel, was a massive, perfectly baked mutton pie. Beside it sat a small, unlabelled jar of remarkably dark, rich fruit chutney. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a silent, solemn expression of gratitude from Mrs. McLean, a promise that the secret they shared would remain buried forever. Hamish carried the basket inside, his stomach giving a loud, appreciative rumble. The station was wonderfully warm, the peat stove glowing a dull, comforting orange in the corner. He took off his heavy greatcoat, tossed his cap onto the desk, and immediately ignored the small stack of official paperwork sitting by the telephone. The phone had rung earlier that morninga brief, thoroughly condescending call from Superintendent Daviot in Strathbane. Daviot had haughtily questioned how Hamish could have been so careless as to leave the murder weapon unguarded on the pier, allowing the syndicate assassin to attempt a theft. Hamish had played his part to perfection, stammering his apologies, employing his thickest, most unintelligent drawl, and lamenting that he was simply too slow for the fast-paced, dangerous world of real police work. Daviot had agreed with insulting swiftness, assuring Hamish that he would never be considered for a transfer to headquarters, as he was clearly only fit for directing stray sheep and drinking tea in the middle of nowhere. It was the greatest victory Hamish had ever achieved. He sliced a generous wedge of the mutton pie, the savoury steam rising into the cold air of the room, and settled into the battered armchair by the stove. He tossed a thick piece of the crust to Lugs, who caught it neatly with a snap of his jaws before curling up on the rag rug. Hamish rested his long legs on the fender, a profound sense of absolute laziness washing over him. The Sassenach developer was gone, DCI Blair was receiving medals in the city, the true killer was safely making beds up at the hotel, and Hamish Macbeth had successfully avoided promotion for another year. He took a bite of the pie, the rich, buttery pastry melting in his mouth. Outside, the Highland wind began to howl around the stone walls of the station, a wild, lonely sound that kept the tourists away and the locals indoors. Hamish closed his eyes, chewing slowly, utterly content. The piece of Lochstub had been paid for, and it was, without a doubt, going to be a beautifully quiet winter.